All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Amelia, zookeeper. The world didn't end with a scream. It ended with the sterile, polite chirp of a cell phone going straight to voicemail. For the 7th time. I stood in the soft, hay-dusted quiet of the capybara enclosure, the Colorado sunset painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples behind the mountains. My hands, usually so steady when checking a hoof or offering a pellet, were trembling. I'd called Mark to ask if he wanted me to pick up dinner, a simple, mundane question from a wife of 9 years to her husband. The first call went to voicemail. Maybe his battery died, I thought. He was a taxi driver, after all. His phone was his livelihood. The second call, 10 minutes later. The third. A cold, sharp little knot began to tighten in my stomach. This was the hook, the first sharp tug on the line of my reality. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were for meatloaf. We had a routine. Mark drove his evening shift, I closed up the zoo, and we'd meet at home, trading stories of difficult passengers and escaped lemurs over a simple meal. It was our rhythm, but that night the rhythm was broken. The phone didn't ring, it just died. Over and over, I tried his dispatcher. Yeah, Mark logged off about an hour ago, Amelia. Said he was beat. An hour ago. The knot turned to ice. I drove home in a daze, the familiar road to our little bungalow feeling alien. His taxi wasn't in the driveway. The house was dark and silent, the way empty houses are, holding their breath. I walked from room to room, turning on lights, each click of the switch echoing too loudly. No note, no message on the landline. I made a cup of tea and let it go cold on the coffee table. I sat on the sofa, the same sofa we'd picked out together, and I stared at the blank television screen, seeing only the reflection of a woman who was starting to look like a ghost. This is the personal story, the everyday reality. I'm a zookeeper. My life is built on routine, on care, on anticipating needs. I know when the snow leopard is anxious by the twitch of its tail. I can sense a sick kangaroo by the look in its eye. How could I not have sensed this? The clues, in retrospect, were there. The new cologne, the way he'd started talking about a regular, a woman who worked downtown, who was really going through something. He'd mentioned her with a casualness that felt forced. Gave her a pep talk today, he'd said once, puffing his chest out slightly. I just smiled, absently, thinking he was being sweet. I was more concerned with a pregnant pygmy goat. The climax of the scene, the breakdown, didn't come that night. It came the next morning. I must have fallen asleep on the couch because I woke with a stiff neck and the gray, flat light of dawn filtering through the windows. The house was still empty. My phone, clutched in my hand, buzzed, not a call, a text message, from Mark. The screen glowed in the dim room. I remember the exact pattern of the cracks on the ceiling above me, the taste of stale fear in my mouth. I tapped the message. It wasn't long. It was brutally, devastatingly simple. Amelia, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. I've met someone else. It's serious. Don't try to find me. I'll come by for my things next week. I read it once, then again, and a third time. The words didn't make sense. They were just black marks on a bright screen. Met someone else. A passenger. The woman he'd given a pep talk to. He'd turned off his phone for her. He'd left our meatloaf Tuesdays, our 9 years, our entire life, for a conversation in the back of a taxi that had turned into dinner, that had turned into this. A text message. He ended our marriage with a text message. The realization, the truth that voiced a pain I didn't yet know I had, washed over me not as a wave, but as a stillness. It was the quietest moment of my life. The animals at the zoo, they have instincts. They know when a storm is coming. I had no instinct for this. I had only trust. And that trust had been a currency he had spent on someone else. The lesson was this. You can build a life on what you believe is solid ground, only to discover it was just a layer of dust over a bottomless crack. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I stood up, walked to the bedroom, and looked at our bed. Then I went to the garage and saw my old bicycle, covered in cobwebs. I didn't know it then, but that bicycle was going to become my life raft. The strong finale, the phrase that stayed with me, formed in my mind as I stared at that text message, now burned onto the back of my eyelids. He didn't even have the courage to hear my voice break. He sent it while I was sleeping, alone in the house we shared. The world didn't end with a scream. It ended with a vibration in the palm of my hand. The sound that followed the text message was the loudest silence I have ever heard. It wasn't just an absence of noise, it was a presence, a physical weight pressing down on the air in our little bungalow, making it hard to breathe. I sat on the edge of the couch, the fabric rough against my skin, and I stared at my phone as if I could force it to take the words back through sheer will. I've met someone else. The letters blurred and sharpened with each frantic beat of my heart. My first instinct, a stupid, hopeful one, was to call again. Maybe it was a mistake, a terrible, drunken joke. Mark wasn't a drinker, but what other explanation could there be? My thumb hovered over his name in my favorites list, a place he had occupied for nearly a decade. I pressed it. The phone rang once, twice, and then clicked over to that familiar, robotic voice. The person you are trying to reach is not available. He had turned it off again. For her. The finality of that sound, that polite rejection, was the hook that sank deep into my gut, pulling me into a new, terrifying reality. This is the personal story, the everyday reality that becomes a prison. I am a zookeeper. My life is defined by cycles of care, by feeding times and enclosure cleanings, by the predictable needs of creatures who cannot lie to you. The morning after the text, I went to work. What else was I supposed to do? The world had ended, but the capybaras still needed their breakfast. The routine was my anchor, even if I was adrift in a sea of shock. Driving to the zoo felt like piloting a ghost ship. I saw other people in their cars, sipping coffee, singing along to the radio, living their normal lives, and it seemed like a bizarre, alien ritual. How could everything look the same when nothing was? The mountains were still towering against the blue Colorado sky, but they felt like a painted backdrop now, fragile and fake. I parked in my usual spot, the gravel crunching under my tires with a sound that was too ordinary, and I walked through the employee entrance. The smell hit me first: hay, straw, animal musk, the sharp tang of disinfectant. It was the smell of my life, of my purpose. Today, it smelled like ashes. My coworker, Brenda, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a perpetual smear of dirt on her cheek, greeted me with her usual cheer. "Morning, Amelia. How's things? Mark get in okay last night? You two have a good anniversary." We'd celebrated our anniversary a month ago. I'd made his favorite lasagna. He'd given me a new pair of work boots. I'd thought we were happy. The question was a knife twist. I managed a strangled sound that I hoped resembled a positive response and hurried towards the primate house. I couldn't look at her. If I saw an ounce of pity or, worse, the dawning understanding of my shame, I would shatter. The animals, at least, didn't ask questions. Kiko, the elderly orangutan, reached a long, gentle arm through the bars as I approached her enclosure. She knew, they always know. Her deep, intelligent eyes held a sadness that mirrored my own. I offered her a piece of fruit, and she took it carefully, her fingers brushing mine. It was the first kind touch I'd felt since this nightmare began. I leaned my forehead against the cool bars, the metal a solid truth against my skin, and let the tears come silently. This was my life now, pretending to be whole for the humans, finding solace in the animals. The climax of the scene built over the next few days, a slow, excruciating pressure cooker of silence and dread. I existed in a state of suspended animation. I went through the motions at work, cleaning enclosures, preparing diets, giving talks to school groups, my voice a steady, professional monotone that belied the chaos within. At home, I wandered the rooms like a ghost. I couldn't sleep in our bed. I slept on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that no longer smelled like him because I had washed everything, scrubbing at the memory of his scent until my hands were raw. I didn't eat. The thought of food made me nauseous. The house was a museum of our life together, every object a relic from a lost civilization. The photo on the mantelpiece from our trip to Santa Fe, both of us sunburned and smiling. The ugly vase his mother gave us that we always joked about but never had the heart to get rid of. His favorite coffee mug, sitting clean and empty in the dishwasher. I was living inside a tomb. I sent him text messages, dozens of them. Pleading, angry, desperate. "Please, Mark, talk to me. What did I do? How could you do this? At least have the decency to tell me to my face." They were all met with the same void, delivered but not read. He had effectively erased me from his life with the tap of a screen. The breaking point, the peak of the emotional tension, came on the fourth day. I was in the reptile house, checking the heat lamps for the bearded dragons when my phone vibrated. It wasn't a call, but an email, from Mark. My heart leaped into my throat, a foolish, traitorous hope flaring. Maybe it was an explanation, an apology, a plea for forgiveness. I opened it with trembling fingers. It was brief and brutally clinical. Amelia, I'll be by on Saturday at 10 a.m. to collect my things. I've made a list of what I'm taking. I've arranged for a storage unit. It would be better if you weren't there. Mark, better for who? For him, so he wouldn't have to see the damage he'd caused. So he could pack up his life with his passenger waiting in the taxi outside. The coldness of it, the absolute cowardice, ignited a fury in me that burned away the shock. I wouldn't grant him that comfort. I wouldn't let him slip away without a trace. I would be there. He would look me in the eye. Saturday morning arrived, gray and drizzly, as if the weather itself was mourning. I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the kitchen table, wearing the same jeans and sweater I'd had on for 2 days, and I waited. I watched the clock tick from 9:55 to 10 o'clock to 10:05. At 10:07, a white rental van pulled into the driveway, not his taxi. He'd rented a van. This was real. The driver's side door opened and he stepped out. He looked the same, my Mark. Same broad shoulders, same way of running a hand through his dark hair. But he was wearing a jacket I'd never seen before, a stylish navy blue windbreaker. A gift from her, probably. He didn't look at the house as he walked to the front door. He had a key, but he knocked. A polite, timid tap, as if I were a stranger. I opened the door. The air between us was charged, thick with 9 years of history and the sharp, new reality of betrayal. He finally looked at me and his eyes skittered away, unable to hold my gaze. He looked guilty and tired, but not sorry enough to stay. "Amelia," he said, his voice low. "Mark." My voice was steadier than I felt. "Are you going to come in, or are you just going to grab your stuff and run?" He flinched. I just want to get this over with." "I bet you do." I stepped aside, and he walked past me into the living room. He had a folded piece of paper in his hand, his list. He started moving through the house like a ghost, picking up items, checking them against his list. A few books from the shelf, a toolbox from the garage, some clothes from the bedroom. I followed him, a silent witness to the dismemberment of our life. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice quiet in the stillness of the house. He paused, his back to me, holding a framed photo of us from a friend's wedding. "It doesn't matter." "It matters to me." The words burst out of me, sharp and broken. "You ended our marriage in a text message, Mark. You owe me that much. Who is she?" "The passenger. The one you were giving pep talks to?" He turned around, his face a mask of defensive anguish. "Yes, okay. Her name is Chloe. She's different. She sees me. She doesn't just see the guy who drives a taxi. She thinks I'm interesting." The realization, the truth that voiced a pain so profound it stole my breath, landed in the center of my chest. She thinks I'm interesting. I thought of our life. The quiet evenings, the shared chores, the comfortable silences. I had seen him as my husband, my partner, the man I loved. I had never thought he needed to be interesting. I had thought he needed to be loved. The lesson was this: love isn't always enough. Sometimes, the person you build a home with decides they'd rather be a guest in someone else's adventure. "I saw you as my husband," I whispered, the fight draining out of me. "I saw you as the man I wanted to grow old with." Was that not enough? He looked down, shamefaced. "It's not about enough, Amelia. It's just different. I'm sorry." He finished loading the van quickly after that, avoiding my eyes. He didn't take everything. He left the furniture, the dishes, the photos. He took his clothes, his tools, his golf clubs, the essentials for starting a new life. When he was done, he stood by the van door. The drizzle had soaked his new jacket. "What about the house?" I asked, numb. "We'll figure it out. Lawyers, I guess." He couldn't even look at me. "I'll have mine contact you." And then he was gone. The van backed out of the driveway and disappeared down the street. I stood in the open doorway, the damp air cooling my face. The house felt enormous and empty around me. But as I stood there, listening to the absolute silence, something shifted inside me. The pain was still there, a raw, open wound. But the waiting was over. The not knowing was over. He was gone. The marriage was dead. The strong finale, the phrase that cemented itself in my mind as I closed the door, was not about him. It was about me. He had left to be someone interesting. Well, I was still here. Amelia, the zookeeper, the the woman who had loved him, the woman who was now alone. But as I looked around the hollowed-out shell of my home, I understood that this was not an ending. It was a terrible, painful beginning. The silence was no longer echoing with his absence. It was waiting for me to fill it with something new. And the only thing I could think of was the bicycle in the garage, covered in dust but still solid, still real. A machine that only moved forward. The hollow silence of the house was a living entity, breathing with me, filling the spaces where Mark's laughter used to be. I woke up on the couch again, my body stiff and protesting, the first gray light of dawn filtering through the windows. For a fleeting second, the space between sleep and waking, I expected to hear the familiar sound of his taxi pulling away for an early shift, the gentle click of the front door, the smell of coffee he'd leave brewing for me. But there was only the silence. It was a physical weight on my chest, heavy and cold. This was the hook, the daily reenactment of my loss, the moment reality crashed through the fragile dam of forgetfulness that sleep provided. I was alone. The word echoed in the empty rooms, a stark, unadorned truth that I had to swallow every morning like a bitter pill. I sat up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders, and looked at the space where the recliner used to be. He'd taken it. On his list. The room had a bald patch now, a visible scar of his absence. This was my life now, waking up to scars. This is the personal story, the everyday reality through the lens of grief. I am a zookeeper. My life is supposed to be about nurturing, about sustaining life. But how could I care for anything when I felt so utterly drained? I drove to the zoo, the Colorado morning crisp and bright, a cruel contrast to the storm inside me. The routine was my anchor, but it felt like I was dragging it through mud. I punched in through the employee entrance, the familiar beep, a sound from a past life. The smells of the zoo, hay, animal feed, disinfectant, usually comforted me, a symphony of purpose. Today, they just smelled of duty. Brenda was already in the break room, stirring a packet of sugar into her coffee. "Morning, Amelia, you're in early." Her cheerfulness was like a splash of cold water. She looked at me, and I saw the moment her smile faltered. The bags under my eyes were probably purple, my hair a messy bun that hadn't seen a brush in 2 days. I hadn't been able to look in a mirror for more than a second. "Couldn't sleep," I mumbled, heading for the coffee pot. My hands shook slightly as I poured a cup, the black liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice dropping into a lower, more concerned register. "You and Mark have a fight?" The question was so normal, so innocent. A fight, a married couple's disagreement. I could have lied. I could have said yes, and she would have nodded sympathetically, offered some advice about giving him space. But the words, "I've met someone else," were burning a hole in my mind. The truth felt too big, too ugly to contain. If I said it out loud, it would make it real in a way the text message and the empty van hadn't. "Something like that," I whispered, unable to meet her eyes. I took my coffee and fled to the sanctuary of the capybara enclosure. The capybaras, bless their simple, placid hearts, were gathered by the fence, waiting for their breakfast. They blinked their slow blinks at me, their world consisting of food, water, and sunbathing. No betrayal, no broken promises. I started my chores on autopilot, mucking out the enclosure, refreshing their water pool. The physical labor was a blessing. It gave my trembling hands something to do. I lost myself in the rhythm of scooping and sweeping, the repetitive motion a dull anesthetic for my brain. But grief is a sneaky predator. It waits for you to let your guard down. I was cutting up sweet potatoes for their feed when a song came on the radio from the maintenance shed nearby. It was a stupid, pop song from a few years back, one that Mark and I had heard on a road trip to Denver. We'd sung along at the top of our lungs, off-key and laughing, his hand on my knee. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. The knife slipped in my hand, nicking my finger. A bright bead of blood welled up. I stared at it, mesmerized by the simple, vivid proof that I was still alive, that I could still feel something other than this crushing numbness. The pain was sharp, clean. It was better than the hollow ache in my chest. I squeezed my finger, watching the blood drip onto the cutting board, mixing with the orange flesh of the sweet potato. This was my life, bleeding onto the food I prepared for innocent creatures. The climax of the scene, the breakdown I had been staving off since Saturday, arrived with the subtlety of an avalanche. It was during the afternoon feeding of the snow leopards. A school group was gathered outside the enclosure, children oohing and awing at the majestic cats. I was giving my standard talk, my voice a professional monotone I barely recognized. The snow leopard is a solitary creature, exceptionally well adapted to its harsh environment, I was saying, when my eyes landed on a little boy in the front row. He was holding his father's hand, pointing excitedly at the leopards. The father bent down, whispering something in the boy's ear, and the boy giggled, leaning into his dad's side. The gesture was so full of easy, unthinking love. It was a gesture I had taken for granted. A gesture I thought I might have one day with Mark. We talked about children vaguely in the someday way. Someday was gone. My voice cracked. I tried to continue. Their thick fur provides insulation against the cold, but the words stuck in my throat. The image of the father and son blurred as my eyes filled with tears. The professional facade I had so carefully constructed shattered into a million pieces. I couldn't breathe. The children's faces swam in front of me, their curious eyes now staring at the crying zookeeper. "I'm sorry," I choked out, and I turned away from the glass, stumbling back into the non-public staff area. I didn't stop until I was in the supply closet, surrounded by sacks of feed and cleaning supplies. I slid down the wall onto the cold concrete floor, pulled my knees to my chest, and sobbed. It was an ugly, raw, uncontrollable crying. I cried for the 9 years I had wasted. I cried for the future I had pictured that was now ash. I cried for the humiliation of being left for a passenger. I cried for the sheer, terrifying loneliness that stretched out in front of me like an endless, empty road. The sounds that came out of me were animalistic, guttural. This was the breakdown. This was the pain I had been trying to outrun by keeping busy, by clinging to routine. It had caught up with me, and it was devouring me whole. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the storm passed, leaving me hollowed out and exhausted. I was sitting in a dark closet, surrounded by the smell of kibble and bleach. This was my rock bottom, huddled on a dirty floor, hiding from schoolchildren. The realization, the truth that began to seep through the numbness, was a quiet one. I couldn't do this alone. The routine wasn't enough. Pretending to be okay was killing me. I had to find a way to carry this pain, to integrate it into my life, or it would bury me. The lesson was this: grief is not an enemy to be defeated, it is a weight to be carried. And to carry it, you have to become stronger. I thought of the bicycle in my garage, the simple, mechanical truth of it. Pedal, move forward, don't look back. It wasn't about joy or happiness, those concepts felt alien and impossible. It was about motion, about proving to myself that I was still capable of moving under my own power. I wiped my face on the sleeve of my work shirt, leaving dirty streaks. I stood up, my legs shaky. I had to finish my shift. I had to feed the snow leopards. I had to go home to the empty house, but I didn't have to stay on the floor. I walked back out into the zoo. The school group was gone. The afternoon sun was warm on my face. Brenda saw me and gave me a small, understanding smile. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. That small gesture of silent solidarity meant more than any words could have. The strong finale, the phrase that settled in my mind as I drove home that evening, was born from the exhaustion and the clarity that follows a great storm. I walked into the garage and looked at the bicycle. It was still covered in cobwebs, a relic of a younger, lighter version of myself. I found a rag and a bucket of soapy water. I didn't think about tomorrow or next week. I thought about the grime on the handlebars. I washed away the dust of years. I cleaned the chain until it gleamed. I pumped air into the tires, listening to the hiss as they inflated, becoming firm and ready. It was a small act, a mundane task. But as I wiped the last of the dirt from the seat, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't pain. It was intention. I would ride tomorrow. I didn't know where. I didn't know for how long, but I would move. The hollowed ground inside me was still there, vast and empty. But maybe, just maybe, I could start to plant something new in it, even if it was just the simple, repetitive act of turning petals. The first turn of the petals was agony. Not just the physical kind, though that was sharp and immediate, a burning in thighs that had forgotten the feel of the motion, a protest from lungs that had been breathing the stagnant air of grief for too long. The real agony was the silence. On a bicycle, there is no engine roar, no radio to blast away the thoughts. There is only the whir of the chain, the rush of wind in your ears, and the relentless, unimpeded access to your own mind. I had chosen a path along the river, a flat, easy trail that should have been gentle, but every push forward felt like a betrayal. I was moving away from the house, from the life I had known, and each rotation of the wheels was a physical confirmation of the distance Mark had created. This was the hook, the brutal irony that the very act of moving forward felt like a new kind of loss. I was leaving behind the woman who waited by the phone, and I had no idea who I was pedaling toward. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of a life being taken apart piece by piece. The bicycle ride became my new, painful routine. I would force myself out of the empty house at dawn, before work, when the Colorado air was still thin and cold. I'd pedal along the river, the water a shimmering, indifferent ribbon beside me. I'd pass other cyclists, their faces set in determined masks of fitness and purpose. I had no purpose. My purpose was to exhaust my body so thoroughly that my mind would have no energy to think. I'd ride until my legs trembled and my vision blurred. Then I'd turn around and ride home, shower, and go to the zoo to tend to creatures whose needs were simple and clear. The animals were my anchor, but the bicycle was my punishment and my penance. At work, the facade was becoming harder to maintain. The legal machinery of our separation had begun to grind into motion. A thick, official envelope from a lawyer's office arrived at the house. I brought it to work, unopened, and left it in my locker like a guilty secret. During my lunch break, I hid in the break room and finally tore it open. The language was cold, legalese that reduced 11 years of shared life to terms like marital assets and equitable distribution. It demanded financial statements, lists of property, a timeline of our separation. It felt like being asked to dissect a corpse. Brenda found me staring at a page, my sandwich untouched. "Everything okay, Amelia?" she asked, her voice gentle. I couldn't lie anymore. The words tumbled out, flat and empty. Mark left me, he met someone else. The silence that followed was different from the one in my house. It was a silence of shared shock. Then, Brenda sat down heavily next to me. "Oh, honey. I'm so sorry." She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say he'd come back or that it was for the best. She just put her hand over mine, a warm, rough, capable hand. "That bastard," she said, with such simple, heartfelt conviction that it was the kindest thing anyone could have said. The climax of the scene, the peak of this new, ongoing tension, came a few days later. I was attempting a hill, a short, steep incline that led away from the river path. My body was screaming, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was standing on the pedals, pouring every ounce of my frustration, my anger, my sadness into the climb. I was almost at the top when a memory ambushed me. It was a vacation we'd taken to San Francisco years ago. We'd rented bicycles and tried to ride across the Golden Gate Bridge. Mark had been terrified of the height and the traffic, but I'd pedaled ahead, laughing, shouting back at him to stop being a baby. At the top, he'd finally caught up, his face pale. "You're crazy, Amelia," he'd said, but he was smiling, and he'd kissed me, right there in the middle of the bridge with the wind whipping around us. The memory was so vivid, so full of a joy that was now poison. It was a glimpse of a sunlit past from the bottom of a deep, dark well. The pain of the memory was a physical blow. My rhythm broke. The bicycle wobbled, and my foot slipped off the pedal. The bike stalled, and I had to put a foot down to keep from falling over. I stood there, straddling the frame, halfway up the hill, defeated. I looked back down the path I'd climbed. The view was beautiful, the river, the trees, the city skyline in the distance, but I couldn't see it. I could only see the ghost of us, laughing on a different bridge in a different life. I dismounted and sat on a bench by the side of the trail, the cold seeping through my cycling shorts. I put my head in my hands and cried, not the violent sobs of the supply closet, but a quiet, weary trickle of tears. This was the breakdown. The understanding that grief wasn't a single event to get over, but a landscape I now had to travel through, and it was full of hidden traps like this one. I sat there for a long time, watching other cyclists conquer the hill I had failed to climb. They made it look effortless. I felt broken. But as I watched them, something shifted. The realization began as a small, stubborn ember in the cold ashes of my self-pity. These people on their bikes, they weren't just moving their bodies. They were moving their lives. They had problems, pains, memories too, probably. but they were still turning the pedals. They fell, they got back on, they faced the hills. The lesson wasn't about conquering the hill in one go, the lesson was about getting back on the bike after you've fallen off. The truth was this: I didn't have to be the woman from the San Francisco memory anymore. That woman was gone, and the man who kissed her was gone. I was just Amelia, on a bench on a hill in Colorado, and I had a choice: to walk the bike back down or to get back on and finish the climb. I wiped my face with the back of my glove. I stood up. My legs felt like jelly. I walked the bike the rest of the way to the top of the hill. Then I got back on. I didn't pedal with rage or desperation. I pedaled with a slow, deliberate determination. The descent on the other side was gradual, and the wind cooled my tear-streaked face. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel victory. I felt something simpler, more fundamental: capability. I had faced a memory that tried to break me, and I had chosen to keep moving. It was a small thing, but in the hollowed-out geography of my new life, it was a mountain I had planted my flag on. The strong finale, the phrase that echoed in my mind as I coasted toward home, was not about Mark or the past. It was about the mechanics of survival. The bicycle chain only worked when it was moving forward. If it tried to go backward, it would derail. I understood now that I was the same. I could look back, I could remember, but I could not go back. The only direction that wouldn't break me was forward, one turn of the pedals at a time. Even if it hurt, even if it was silent, even if I had to get off and walk sometimes, the motion itself was the point. There is a particular silence that exists only in the deepest part of the night, a silence so absolute it feels like a physical presence in the room. It was 3:17 a.m., and I was drowning in it. I was on the floor of my living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes. The lawyer's requests had forced my hand. I had to start cataloging a life that was no longer mine. I wasn't packing to leave. I was packing to prove that I was still here, that these objects, these spoons, these books, these mismatched socks belonged to someone. To me. The hook was not in the sadness, but in the surreal, mundane horror of the task. Holding a souvenir shot glass from a trip to Niagara Falls, trying to decide if it was a marital asset or just a piece of junk. This was my life now, reduced to inventorying trinkets at 3 in the morning, trying to find evidence of my own existence in the debris of a finished marriage. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of hitting bottom. The days had begun to blur into a monochrome smear of work, cycling, and sleeplessness. The initial sharp agony of the betrayal had softened into a constant, dull ache, a background hum of sadness that colored everything. At the zoo, I functioned. I could feed the animals, clean the enclosures, even smile at visitors. But I felt like a ghost, going through the motions of a life that had already ended. Brenda had started gently inviting me for coffee after work, but I always declined. I couldn't bear the thought of normal conversation, of pretending I was okay. The only place I felt anything resembling real was on the bicycle. The pain in my muscles was honest. The burn in my lungs was a feeling I had earned. It was a pain I could control. The climax, the moment the bottom fell out completely, was triggered by something absurdly small. It was a Thursday. I had decided to tackle the bedroom closet, the last bastion of Mark's presence. I pulled out shirts, suits, shoes, piling them into boxes for donation. The closet smelled faintly of him, that mix of cheap cologne and gasoline from the taxi. I worked mechanically, numbly, until my hand brushed against something tucked away on the top shelf behind a hat box. It was a small, clumsily wrapped gift. My name was on the tag in his familiar, looping handwriting. To Amelia for our 10th. Our 10th anniversary was still months away. He must have bought it early, hidden it, and forgotten about it in the whirlwind of his new affair. My hands trembled as I tore the paper away. Inside was a small, velvet box. I opened it. Nestled inside was a delicate silver necklace with a pendant, a tiny, beautifully crafted capybara, my favorite animal. He'd remembered. He'd seen it and thought of me. He'd planned a future where he would give this to me, where we would celebrate a decade together. The contrast between that intention and the cold, dismissive text message was too vast to comprehend. It wasn't the infidelity that broke me in that moment. It was the evidence of a love that had, however briefly, been real. The memory of that love, now poisoned, was infinitely more painful than the betrayal itself. I sank to the floor of the closet, surrounded by his clothes, clutching the tiny silver capybara in my fist. The sobs that racked my body were silent, desperate things. This was the breakdown. This was the bottom of the well. I had thought I was numb, but this was a fresh, new layer of hell. He hadn't just left me. He had left the man who bought this necklace. He had discarded that version of himself along with me. I was grieving not just for my lost husband, but for his lost self. The pain was so acute it was nauseating. I curled into a ball on the carpet, the pendant digging into my palm. I didn't have the energy to cry anymore. I just lay there, empty, staring at the dust bunnies under the hanging shirts. This was it. This was as far down as I could go. I don't know how long I lay there. But as the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky outside the window, a thought surfaced, slow and stubborn. Get on the bike. It wasn't a hopeful thought. It was an imperative. A command from some deep, survivalist part of my brain that hadn't yet been extinguished. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being felt heavy, leaden with despair. But the thought was insistent. Move. The realization, the truth that began to glimmer in the utter darkness was this. Rock bottom isn't a place you stay. It's a foundation. However terrible, however painful, it is solid ground. There is nothing below it. The only way is up. The lesson was not about feeling better. It was about the simple, brute force act of choosing to move when moving feels impossible. I pushed myself up from the floor. My body ached. I walked to the garage, a sleepwalker. I didn't change into cycling clothes. I got on the bike in my pajama shorts and an old t-shirt. I started to pedal. The morning air was cold against my bare legs. I didn't have a route. I just went. I pedaled through my neighborhood, past houses where other people were still asleep, still whole. I pedaled until the town fell away and the open road stretched out before me, lined with fields and fences. The sun rose, painting the world in gold and pink. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't pedaling to escape the pain. I was pedaling with the pain. I carried it with me. It was a part of me, a heavy weight in my chest, but my legs were still strong enough to turn the pedals. The motion didn't lessen the hurt, but it proved I could endure it. The strong finale, the phrase that settled in me as I turned for home, was born from that endurance. I looked down at the road flowing away beneath my wheels. I was moving forward. The past was behind me, a landscape of wreckage. The future was unknown, a blank map. But in this moment on this bike, I was alive. I was breathing. I was capable. The tiny capybara pendant was still clutched in my hand, its edges sharp. I had taken it with me. I didn't know if I would ever wear it, but I knew I wouldn't leave it behind in the dark of the closet. It was mine now. Not a symbol of his love, but a trophy from the battle. A reminder that I had survived the bottom of the well, and that I had, with my own 2 legs, begun the long climb out. The first breath of air that didn't feel like shards of glass in my lungs came on a Tuesday. It was unremarkable, that breath. I was on my bicycle, pedaling along the river path, the morning sun warm on my back. I wasn't thinking about Mark. I wasn't thinking about the divorce papers sitting unsigned on my kitchen table. I was thinking about the way the light dappled through the leaves of the cottonwood trees, creating a shifting, dancing pattern on the pavement ahead of me. For a full minute, maybe 2, my mind was quiet. The constant, grinding soundtrack of my grief had simply paused. The hook wasn't a moment of dramatic triumph. It was this subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The absence of pain, however brief, was so startling it was itself a kind of sensation. It was the first time I realized that healing might not be a destination I would arrive at, but a series of small, temporary reprieves that would gradually grow longer. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of a slow, stubborn recovery. The bicycle was no longer an instrument of punishment. It had become my sanctuary, my moving meditation. I had established a new, stricter routine. Up at 5 a.m., on the bike by 5:30, 20 miles along the river before my shift at the zoo. The physical transformation was becoming visible. The softness of my body had been replaced by lean muscle. My skin was tanned from the sun. But the internal changes were more profound. The rides were no longer about drowning out the thoughts, they were about processing them. I'd pedal and I'd let the memories come. The good ones, the bad ones. I'd cry sometimes, the wind whipping the tears away. I'd get angry and pedal harder, my legs burning with the effort. but I was no longer afraid of the emotions. I was moving through them, literally. At work, I was emerging from my shell. I started accepting Brenda's offers for coffee. We'd sit in the break room, and I'd talk, haltingly at first, about the divorce process, about the sheer bureaucratic boredom of unraveling a life. She'd listen, never offering unsolicited advice, just nodding. One day, she brought in a flyer. "Saw this and thought of you," she said, sliding it across the table. It was for the annual Colorado River Valley Century Ride, a 100-mile cycling event a few months away. "A century?" I said, my eyes wide. "Brenda, I'm just trying to get through 20 miles without having a mental breakdown," she shrugged. "So, you've got time to train, might be something to work toward. Besides, it's for a good cause, raises money for the state parks." I took the flyer and stuck it on my fridge when I got home. I didn't commit to it, but I didn't throw it away. It was a small, hypothetical pebble of a future goal tossed into the still pond of my present. The climax of this scene, the test of my fragile new equilibrium, came from an unexpected direction. I was in the grocery store, a place I'd avoided because every aisle was a minefield of memories. His favorite cereal, the brand of coffee he drank, the ice cream we'd share on the couch. I was navigating it carefully, head down, list in hand, when I heard a laugh. A familiar, booming laugh that stopped me dead in the middle of the frozen food section. It was Mark. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. There he was at the end of the aisle. He wasn't alone. A young woman with long, blonde hair was with him, her hand tucked into the back pocket of his jeans. She was laughing at something he'd said. Chloe, the passenger. She was pretty in a conventional way. Young, my age when I'd met him. They looked happy. They looked like a normal couple doing their normal grocery shopping. The sight was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The old pain, the sharp, searing kind, flared to life. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to throw something. I stood there, frozen, a carton of almond milk in my hand, feeling like a ghost in my own life. He looked up and saw me. His smile vanished. His eyes widened in a mixture of shock and guilt. Chloe, sensing the shift, followed his gaze. Her expression was curious, then cautiously possessive. She moved closer to him. The three of us, suspended in a moment of awful, silent recognition. This was the breakdown I had feared, the direct confrontation with the reality that had replaced me. I expected to crumble. I expected the sobs, the rage, the flight. But something else happened. As I stood there, looking at the man who had been my husband, a strange calm settled over me. He looked small. The magic I had remembered, the larger-than-life presence, was gone. He was just a man in a grocery store, looking uncomfortable because he'd run into his ex-wife. The realization, the truth that came to me in that frozen food aisle, was as clear as the glass doors of the freezer cases. I wasn't the same woman he had left. That woman would have been destroyed by this sight. But I had spent months rebuilding myself, mile by painful mile. I had faced the bottom of the well and climbed out. I had endured the silence and filled it with the sound of my own breathing, my own heart beating. The love I had for him was a relic, an artifact from a past life. The person standing before me was a stranger. The lesson was this: you don't get over a loss by forgetting it. You get over it by growing so large that the loss becomes a part of you, but not the whole of you. I didn't say a word. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, not of friendship or forgiveness, but of finality. Then I turned my cart around and walked away. My hands were shaking, but my head was high. I finished my shopping. I paid for my groceries. I loaded them into my car, and I drove home. I didn't cry. I didn't call Brenda. I went into my garage and looked at my bicycle. Then I looked at the flyer for the Century Ride on my fridge. The strong finale, the phrase that cemented itself as I stood there, was simple. I was no longer running from my past. I was training for my future. The encounter with Mark hadn't broken me, it had shown me how strong I had become. The pain was still there, a scar tissue over my heart, but it was no longer an open wound. I took the flyer off the fridge. I went online, and I registered for the Century Ride. It was an insane goal, 100 miles. But as I clicked the submit button, I felt a thrill that was entirely my own. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about revenge. It was about me. Amelia, the zookeeper, the cyclist, the survivor. The woman who was finally, after a long and brutal winter, taking her first full breath of spring. The first time I rode 50 miles, I threw up in a ditch by the side of the road. It wasn't a graceful, cinematic moment. It was a raw, gagging, humiliating expulsion of breakfast and electrolyte drink, my body screaming in rebellion against the ambition of my mind. I clung to my bike, trembling, spit hanging from my lips, and I started to laugh. A wild, slightly unhinged sound that scared a nearby crow into flight. This was the hook, the absurd, messy reality of transformation. It wasn't a montage of glowing health and serene smiles. It was vomit and sweat and the realization that I was pushing myself to an edge I never knew existed. And I was still standing. Or, well, leaning. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of building a new self, brick by painful brick. Training for the century ride became the central axis of my existence. My life narrowed into a focused routine: work, eat, sleep, ride. The zoo was my recovery time. The gentle, predictable rhythms of the animals were a balm to my screaming muscles. I'd spend my lunch hours studying route maps and nutrition guides instead of staring at the divorce paperwork, which was now progressing with the grim inevitability of a glacier. My lawyer was handling it. I signed where I was told. It felt less like the end of a marriage and more like the closing of a defunct business. The cycling community, which I had only observed from a distance, began to seep into my life. I'd nod to the same riders on the river path at dawn. A gruff, older man on a sleek carbon fiber bike started offering unsolicited advice. "Your seat's too low, you're wasting energy," he'd grunt as he passed me. At first, I bristled. But the next day, I adjusted my seat. The difference was immediate. It was a small lesson in accepting help, in understanding that I didn't have to rebuild myself in total isolation. I started stopping at the same coffee shop after my long Saturday rides, a place called the Grinding Gear, which was popular with cyclists. I'd sit alone at a small table, covered in road grime, my legs feeling like overcooked noodles, and sip a massive latte. I was a ghost there, but a ghost who was beginning to feel a faint connection to the world of the living. The climax of this scene, the test of my newfound strength, came on a training ride meant to simulate the first half of the century. It was a 60-mile loop with a brutal 2-mile climb at the 45-mile mark. I'd been dreading it all week. The weather was turning, the sky a threatening slate gray. I almost talked myself out of it. But the memory of Mark's face in the grocery store, that look of pity and guilt, flashed in my mind. I wouldn't let fear or weather or his ghost dictate my life anymore. I went. The first 40 miles were tough but manageable. Then the sky opened up. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a cold, horizontal deluge that felt like needles against my skin. The wind howled, pushing against me. By the time I reached the base of the big climb, I was already shivering, my fingers numb on the handlebars. The road snaked upward into the low-hanging clouds, disappearing into the gloom. This was the breakdown. This was the moment every doubt I had ever nurtured came screaming back. You can't do this. You're not an athlete. You're just a sad, divorced zookeeper pretending to be someone she's not. Turn around. Go home. The voice in my head was loud, persuasive. I felt a sob building in my throat. I was alone on a mountain road, in a storm, about to attempt something far beyond my capability. It was the perfect metaphor for my entire life. I unclipped my feet from the pedals and put a foot down, staring up the invisible road. I was ready to quit. But as I stood there, the rain soaking through my jacket, I thought about the capybara pendant, which I now wore tucked under my jersey on every ride. I thought about the bottom of the closet floor. I had already survived the worst. What was a little rain? What was a hill? The realization wasn't a thunderclap of inspiration. It was a quiet, stubborn click. The lesson was this: the voice telling you to quit is a liar. It's the part of you that is afraid of being hurt again, of failing. But you have already been hurt. You have already faced the worst failure. And you are still here. The only way to truly lose now is to listen to that voice. I clipped back in. I didn't look at the top of the hill. I looked at the patch of road 3 feet in front of my wheel. Just get to that crack, I told myself. I pedaled. The bike wobbled. My lungs burned. The rain blinded me. I shifted into my lowest gear and focused on nothing but the circular motion of my legs. Now get to that leaf. I inched forward. It was agony, but it was a chosen agony. This wasn't being done to me, I was choosing to do it. With every painful rotation, I was weaving a new thread of resilience into the fabric of my being. I passed the halfway point. My vision tunneled. I started counting pedal strokes. 10, 20, 50. I didn't think, I just counted and pedaled. And then the incline began to lessen. The road flattened out. I had reached the top. I couldn't see the view. The clouds enveloped me in a wet, gray blanket. But it didn't matter. The victory wasn't in the view. It was in the climb. I stood on the pedals, my body screaming, and let out a sound that was half sob, half triumphant roar, swallowed by the wind. I had done it. I had faced the mountain and the storm, and I had not turned back. The strong finale, the truth that settled in my bones as I began the cold, treacherous descent, was more valuable than any medal. I was not just healing. I was becoming formidable. The woman who had been shattered by a text message was gone. In her place was a woman who could look a storm in the eye and say, "Is that all you have?" The divorce, the betrayal, the pain, they were not the end of my story. They were the fire that had forged me into something stronger, something more resilient. I was Amelia, the zookeeper, and I was Amelia, the cyclist. And soon I would be Amelia, the century rider. The unraveling was over. Now I was doing the weaving. And the pattern I was starting to see was entirely my own. They say that before a transformation, something must break. I had broken, of course, in every way a person can. But on the morning of the century ride, as I stood amidst a sea of spandex and carbon fiber, I felt whole. The training had sculpted my body, but it had also rewired my mind. The hook wasn't fear or excitement, it was a profound, quiet certainty. I belonged here. My bike was no longer an escape vehicle, it was an extension of my will. I checked my tire pressure, my hydration pack, the silver capybara pendant tucked safely under my jersey. I was Amelia, the zookeeper. I was Amelia, the cyclist. And for the next 100 miles, that was all I needed to be. The starting horn blared, and the river of riders began to flow. I merged into the current, my legs finding a rhythm they knew by heart. This was not about the past. This was about the road ahead. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of a life reclaimed. The first 50 miles were a euphoric blur. I moved with the pack, the collective energy a tangible force. We sped through valleys, past fields of wildflowers, the Rocky Mountains standing as silent, majestic sentinels. I chatted briefly with other riders, a teacher from Denver, a retired couple from Boulder. The conversation was easy, superficial, and exactly what I needed. I was just another rider. There was no pity in their eyes, no knowledge of my story. I was defined only by my ability to turn the pedals. I felt a joy so sharp and pure it brought tears to my eyes, tears that were instantly whipped away by the wind. This was what I had been working toward. This feeling of strength, of belonging to myself. The route turned onto a long, winding descent through a pine forest. The air grew cool and smelled of damp earth and resin. We were spaced out now, each rider finding their own pace. I tucked into an aerodynamic position, savoring the speed, the bike humming beneath me. I was flying. And then a deer. It burst from the trees on my right, a panicked flash of brown and white. I swerved violently. My front wheels skidded on a patch of loose gravel. Time slowed to a crawl. I felt the bike go out from under me. There was a sickening crunch of metal and carbon fiber, a searing pain in my shoulder and hip, and then the world was a chaos of spinning sky and tearing fabric. I slid across the asphalt and came to a jarring stop in the ditch, tangled in my bike. The climax, the moment of impact, was both physical and emotional. The pain was immediate, a hot, bright fire in my shoulder. But worse was the devastating shame. I'd failed. After all this, I'd crashed. I couldn't finish. The century ride was over. I lay there, gasping, staring at the canopy of pine trees, feeling like the universe had played a cruel, final joke on me. This was the breakdown, not just of my body, but of the new identity I had so carefully constructed. I was still the woman things happened to. Then, a shadow fell over me. "Whoa, easy there. Don't move." The voice was calm, deep, and laced with concern. I turned my head, wincing. A cyclist was kneeling beside me, having skidded to a stop. He had a kind, strong-boned face under his helmet, flecked with the gray of his short-cropped beard. His eyes, a warm shade of hazel, scanned me with a professional assessment. "My name's Ben. I saw the whole thing. That deer came out of nowhere. Can you tell me where it hurts? Tears of pain and humiliation welled in my eyes. My shoulder, I managed to choke out. My bike, the ride? The ride can wait, he said, his voice firm but gentle. He carefully untangled my limbs from the bike, his hands surprisingly deft. He didn't try to yank me up. He assessed the situation. Your shoulder might be dislocated. Your bike, the front wheel is toast. He looked at me, his gaze steady. What's your name? Amelia, I whispered. Okay, Amelia, I'm going to call for support. There's a sag wagon about 10 minutes back. He pulled out his phone, his movements efficient and reassuring. As he spoke to the event organizers, giving our location, I noticed his bike leaning against a tree. It was a well-loved but high-quality machine, not a showpiece, a tool for a serious rider. He was built like two powerful legs, a lean torso. He finished the call and turned back to me. They're on their way. Just try to relax. The realization, the truth that began to pierce through the pain and embarrassment, was about the nature of help. Mark's betrayal had taught me that depending on someone was a vulnerability that led to devastation. I had learned to be entirely self-reliant. But this man, this stranger, had stopped his own race to help me. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just helping. The lesson was this: true strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being able to accept it with grace when it's offered, and recognizing that some people offer it without strings attached. The sag wagon arrived, and Ben helped the attendants gently load my broken bike and my hurting self into the van. He gave me a card with his number on it. I run a bike shop in town, he said. The grinding gear, when you're feeling up to it, bring the bike in. I'll take a look at it, no charge. And I hope you're okay. He smiled, a warm, crinkling around the eyes smile that felt genuine. Then he climbed back on his bike and continued his ride, a knight in shining lycra who had chosen to forfeit his own time for a stranger. The strong finale, the phrase that stayed with me as the sag wagon bumped its way back to the start line, was not about the crash or the failure to finish. It was about the collision itself. I had collided with a deer, yes. I had collided with the pavement. But I had also collided with a moment of profound human kindness. The century ride hadn't ended the way I'd planned. I hadn't crossed the finish line with my arms raised in victory. But as I sat in that van, clutching Ben's slightly grease-stained business card, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. A flicker of curiosity about the future. The road had thrown an obstacle in my path, and in doing so, it had introduced me to a detour I never could have imagined. The crash wasn't an ending. It was a very strange, very painful, and unexpectedly hopeful beginning. The pain in my shoulder was a constant, throbbing reminder of the crash, but the ache in my pride was somehow sharper. A week had passed since the century ride. I'd been to the doctor. A severe sprain, no break, but a strict order to rest. The crumpled form of my bicycle leaned against the wall in my garage, a sad sculpture of failure. Every time I looked at it, I saw the deer, the skid, the asphalt rushing up to meet me. But I also saw a pair of kind hazel eyes and a grease-stained business card. The hook was the nervous flutter in my stomach as I stared at that card taped to my fridge. It was time to face the damage, both to my bike and to my fiercely guarded independence. Taking it to Ben meant admitting I needed help. Again, this is the personal story, the everyday reality of a carefully controlled life being gently pried open. The zoo was my sanctuary during my recovery. I was on light duty, assigned to paperwork and observing the animals, my arm in a sling. The routine was familiar, but my mind was elsewhere. Brenda, of course, had extracted the entire story of the crash and the handsome stranger who had come to my rescue. Ben, from the grinding gear? Oh, he's a sweetheart, she'd said, a knowing glint in her eye. Fixed my nephew's bike last year, did a great job, and he's easy on the eyes. Single, too, since his divorce a few years back. I'd shushed her, feeling a blush creep up my neck. This wasn't about that. This was about a broken bicycle. It was a practical matter. I clung to that practicality like a life raft. Finally, on a Saturday morning, I loaded the wounded bike into my car, a clumsy, one-armed ordeal that took far longer than it should have. The grinding gear bike shop was located in a quaint, brick-lined street downtown. Through the window, I could see bikes hanging from the ceiling and the glow of workbench lights. My heart hammered against my ribs. What if he didn't remember me? What if he was just being polite? What if this was all a pathetic fantasy born from loneliness and a knock to the head? I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. A bell jingled. The smell of rubber, grease, and clean metal washed over me. And there he was, standing behind the counter, explaining something about derailleurs to a customer. He looked up at the sound of the bell, and his eyes, those warm, calm eyes, found mine. A genuine smile spread across his face. "Amelia," he said, his voice laced with recognition and what sounded like real pleasure. "I've been wondering how you were doing." He finished with his customer and came around the counter. His gaze went immediately to my sling. "Shoulder still giving you trouble?" "It's okay," I said, my voice a little too high. "The bike, it's not okay." I gestured lamely toward the door. "Let's have a look," he said, and he followed me outside. The climax of the scene came as he examined the wreckage. He didn't just give it a cursory glance. He knelt down, his movements sure and practiced, his hands, strong, capable hands with clean nails, gently turning the bent front wheel. "Oof, yeah, the fork is toast. Wheel is tacoed, but the frame looks straight," he mused, talking more to himself than to me. "We can save her. It'll need a new fork, new wheel, new handlebar tape. I'd recommend a full tune-up while we're at it." He looked up at me. "She's a good bike, worth fixing." His respect for the machine, his immediate assurance that it was worth fixing, struck a chord deep within me. It was the opposite of how I'd been made to feel by Mark: disposable, replaceable. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away rapidly. Stupid, post-concussion emotions. Ben stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at me, really looked at me, and his expression softened. "The first crash after you start taking cycling seriously is always the worst. It feels like the universe is telling you to quit, but it's not. It's just reminding you to wear your helmet." He gave me a small, wry smile. "Which you did, so well done." The breakdown of my defenses wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. It was the way he included himself in the community of cyclists with that "you." It was the way he acknowledged the emotional impact of the crash without dismissing it. The realization, the truth that settled over me in that sunny street outside his shop, was simple. This was a man who understood that broken things could be mended, and he wasn't afraid of the work it required. "I'd like you to fix it," I said, my voice firmer now. "Great," he said. "It'll take a few days for the parts to come in." "I'll give you a call?" He phrased it as a question. "Yes, please." I handed him my keys so he could unload the bike from my car. As he worked, effortlessly lifting the bike out, I noticed a small, faded tattoo on his forearm. A simple line drawing of a mountain range. "You never finished your ride," I said suddenly. He shrugged, sliding the bike into the shop. "There will be other rides. Making sure you were okay was more important." The lesson was this: some people enter your life with the gentle precision of a master mechanic. They don't force their way in, they simply see what's broken and offer their skills. Trust isn't a leap of faith. It's a series of small, careful actions, like truing a wobbly wheel, each one bringing you closer to balance. The strong finale happened as I was leaving. He walked me to my car. "You know," he said hesitantly, "once the bike is ready and you're cleared to ride, there's a great, flat recovery route along the reservoir." "No, dear, very smooth pavement. I don't know, if you'd want a guide for your first ride back, I'd be happy to join you." No pressure. It wasn't a grand, romantic gesture. It was a practical, kind offer from one cyclist to another, but it was an opening, a detour on the map of my new life that I hadn't known was there. I looked at him, at his open, honest face, and for the first time in over a year, I felt a spark of something that wasn't pain or grief or determination. It was anticipation. "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. The morning of the recovery ride, I stood in front of my closet for a full 10 minutes, my good hand hovering over my cycling kits. It was a ridiculous, trivial anxiety, but it was real. What does one wear for a first ride with the handsome, kind bike shop owner who witnessed your most spectacular failure? I finally chose a simple black jersey and black shorts. Understated. Safe. The hook was this flutter of nervousness, so different from the dread that had once accompanied my mornings. This was the anxiety of something new, something that held the faint, terrifying promise of happiness. I fastened the silver capybara pendant around my neck, a secret talisman, and took a deep breath. Today wasn't about speed or distance. It was about learning how to ride without fear. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of a heart tentatively testing its wings. I drove to the reservoir, my repaired bike secure in the trunk. Ben was already there, leaning against his own car, sipping from a thermos. He waved when he saw me, that same easy, genuine smile. He was dressed in a simple blue jersey, no fancy team logos, just a man who loved to ride. "Ready to break her in?" he asked, gesturing to my bike as I unloaded it. "I'm a little nervous," I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. "Completely normal," he said, his tone matter of fact. "We'll take it slow. The goal is to remember that riding is fun. No pressure, no Strava. Just wheels turning." And that's what we did. We set off along the smooth, flat path that circled the reservoir. The pace was leisurely, conversational. The morning was stunning, the water a sheet of glass reflecting the mountains. For the first mile, I was hyper-aware of every bump, every slight twinge in my shoulder. But Ben kept up a steady stream of easy chatter, pointing out a heron standing sentinel on the shore, telling a funny story about a customer who tried to fix his own brakes with duct tape. His voice was calm, his presence steadying. Slowly, my death grip on the handlebars loosened. My breathing evened out. I started to look around, to see the beauty of the morning instead of just the pavement in front of my wheel. The climax of the scene came about halfway around the reservoir. We stopped at a bench to drink some water. The sun was higher now, warming our skin. We sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the light dance on the water. "You know," Ben said, breaking the quiet, "I didn't just stop for you because it was the right thing to do." I looked at him, curious. "I saw you about 20 miles before the crash," he continued, his gaze fixed on the water. "You were climbing that hill before the descent into the valley. You were out of the saddle, grinding it out, and you had this look on your face, not pain exactly, more like absolute determination. I remember thinking, there's someone who knows how to fight." He turned to me, his hazel eyes serious. "When I saw you crash, it felt like watching a warrior fall. I couldn't just ride by." His words landed in the center of my chest, warm and solid. He hadn't seen me as a victim. He hadn't seen me as broken. He had seen a fighter. It was the greatest gift anyone had given me since my life had fallen apart. The breakdown of my remaining walls wasn't a collapse. It was a gentle dissolution, like mist burning off in the morning sun. The realization, the truth that bloomed within me, was so simple it was profound. I was seen. Not for what I had lost, but for who I had become in the process of losing. The lesson was this: the right person won't try to fix you because they don't see you as broken. They will see the strength your scars represent and will value you for it. "I don't feel like a warrior most days," I said softly. "None of us do," he replied. "But that's what we are, every time we get back on the bike. Every time we get out of bed after a bad day. It's all a fight. And you, Amelia, are one of the strongest people I've ever met." We finished the loop, the ride back filled with a new, easy companionship. The nervousness was gone, replaced by a quiet joy. As we loaded our bikes back onto our cars, he turned to me. "I know a great place that does pancakes the size of your plate. If you're not in a rush." I was. I was in a rush to say yes. "I'd love that," I said. The strong finale came later, sitting across from him in a sunny diner, sticky with maple syrup and laughing at a story about his failed attempt to bake a birthday cake for his daughter. I looked at this man, this kind, solid, unassuming man, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. This wasn't a whirlwind. It wasn't a dramatic romance. It was a slow, steady sunrise after a long, cold night. I hadn't been looking for him. I had been looking for myself. And in finding myself, I had somehow found my way to him. The recovery ride was over. I was healed enough to begin again. I stood in front of the full-length mirror, but the woman looking back was a stranger I was delighted to finally meet. Her silhouette was sharp against the simple ivory silk of the wedding dress, a garment chosen for its elegance and its ability to allow me to move, to breathe. My hands, usually nicked and calloused from zoo work and bike repairs, were steady as I adjusted the silver capybara pendant at my throat, my something old. A touchstone from the life I'd lost and the woman I'd been. The hook was not nervousness, but a profound, quiet astonishment. How had I gotten here? From the floor of a closet, clutching that same pendant as my world ended, to this sunlit room on the cusp of a new beginning. The journey between those 2 points felt like a continent I had crossed alone, on foot, and now I was standing on a beautiful, unexpected shore. This is the personal story, the everyday reality of a love built not on fairy tales, but on shared pavement and quiet understanding. Our wedding was small, in a meadow at the foot of the Rockies, surrounded by a handful of true friends. Brenda was my beaming matron of honor. Ben's daughter, a bright-eyed 12-year-old with his same kind eyes, was our flower girl. There were no vows about never having hurt or promising a life without storms. Instead, we promised to be each other's best mechanic, to always carry an extra tube, to choose the scenic route together, and to never, ever leave a text message as a way to say goodbye. We promised to keep showing up, with grease under our fingernails and hope in our hearts. The climax of the scene, the last ghost from the past, appeared not as a specter, but as a piece of news. It was a month after the wedding. Ben and I were in our new home, a modern apartment in the city with a garage big enough for 2 bikes and a balcony overlooking the park. We were covered in flour, attempting to make a pizza from scratch, a comical joint activity that was becoming a weekly tradition. The radio was playing softly in the background. A local news segment came on, a brief item about city initiatives for the homeless. The reporter mentioned a name, and my knife, which was slicing peppers, stilled. It was Mark's name. The report was about a new outreach program, and they'd interviewed a man living in a shelter who had once been a local taxi driver. He'd lost his job, his home, and the reporter said, with a tone of vague pity, his relationship with the woman he left his wife for had ended abruptly. The air left the room. I stood there, a bright green pepper half sliced on the board, and felt the world tilt. Ben, sensing the shift immediately, turned down the radio. He didn't say anything. He just waited, his presence a solid anchor in the sudden emotional whirlpool. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times. I had fantasized about revenge, about him getting his comeuppance, about feeling a surge of vindictive joy. But what I felt was nothing. A hollow sadness, like hearing about a tragedy in a faraway country. There was no schadenfreude, no victory. The man in that report was a stranger. The connection between us had been severed so completely that his suffering was just another sad story in a world full of them. The breakdown wasn't in me. It was the final dissolution of the last remaining thread that tied me to that old pain. The realization, the truth that washed over me as I looked at Ben's concerned face, was the final, liberating lesson of my entire journey. My happiness was no longer contingent on Mark's failure. My worth was not defined by his downfall. I had built a life so full, so rich, so resilient, that his tragedy could not touch it. The lesson was this: the ultimate revenge is not a life lived well in spite of someone. It's a life lived so well that you become indifferent to their orbit entirely. Your happiness becomes its own gravity, and the past simply floats away, weightless. "Are you okay?" Ben asked softly, his hand coming to rest on my flour-dusted back. I looked at him, at our messy kitchen, at the life we were building together, piece by piece, pizza by pizza. I thought of the century ride I'd finally completed, with Ben riding by my side the whole way. I thought of the capybara enclosure at work, where I now led educational tour for children, my story a hidden part of my strength. "I'm more than okay," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "It's just sad, but it's not my sadness anymore." I finished slicing the pepper. Ben went back to kneading the dough. We didn't talk about it again. The moment passed, absorbed into the comfortable, loving rhythm of our life together. It was the final exorcism. The strong finale came later that evening. We were on our balcony, watching the stars emerge over the city. My head was on Ben's shoulder, his arm around me. The lights of the city twinkled below, each one a story, a life, a struggle, a joy. "You know," I said, my voice quiet in the twilight, "I used to think that what happened with Mark broke me. But it didn't. It broke the container I was in, the person I was supposed to be. It shattered the life I thought I was required to live. And all the pieces, they weren't debris. They were raw materials." Ben kissed the top of my head. "And you built something beautiful with them." I looked out at the vast, star-dusted sky, the new geography of my heart feeling as expansive and full of possibility as the universe above. The pain hadn't been a detour, it had been the path. The betrayal hadn't been an ending, it had been the necessary clearing of the land for a new foundation. I was Amelia, the zookeeper. I was Amelia, the cyclist. I was Amelia, the wife of a good man. But most of all, I was finally, completely, and unshakably myself. The upgrade was complete.